Hello and welcome to CU Live. I'm Susan Post, Associate Editor of Columbus Underground. Today I have with me Liz Whelan, the Data Manager at MORPC. Liz, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Susan.
So what says data more than census numbers? So today we're going to talk a little bit more about the census and some of the results and what that means for the region. So first of all, what role did MORPC play in the 2020 census efforts in Central Ohio?
So MORPC was very excited to participate in the census because, as you say, what says data more than census? And it's so important and integrated into so much of the work that we do. So it's really important as a result of that we're doing everything that we can to encourage a complete count for the census, that everyone gets counted so that we get the most robust and accurate information possible. So our leadership was engaged in the 2020 census through involvement in the Franklin County and Columbus Complete Count Committee, as serving on that committee and also serving as chair on the local government subcommittee. We also had a role at the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition. So both of those were sort of that leadership level. How do we engage our communities and encourage a complete count? From a more technical perspective, we've also been engaged not just in the recent year when most of the activity was happening, but also throughout the decade. So providing support to our local governments by supporting communities as they updated their addresses for the Census Bureau, and also making sure that all of their boundary changes and annexations that have occurred over the last decade were accurate and complete. We also provided some technical support in helping to evaluate changes to what is a census urbanized area definition, and then also looking at some of the changes to the census's data privacy standards and how that might impact the accuracy of the numbers.
And you kind of mentioned this, why is it so important to get the most accurate numbers that you can? What all does this kind of affect as far as those numbers go?
That's a really great question, because the census has its own sort of legislative mandate, right? Where it's used for redistricting and apportionment and all these things we hear the big headlines about in the press. But on a more local level, it has a lot of meaningful relevance too. So we use it in our work to help us with our long-range transportation planning. So it helps us when we try to predict where are the people and jobs of the future in Central Ohio going to be, so that we can plan for the right kinds and the most robust transportation system in Central Ohio that we can.
So can you share some kind of high-level statistics on the census results and what they mean for Columbus as a city, our metropolitan statistical area, and sort of also the region?
So right now we still only have a partial picture from the 2020 census numbers, but we do have some really good information to get us started. So we know that we were pretty close when we estimated that we had a population of about 2.4 million people in Central Ohio as of 2020. And so the census numbers, they matched up with our estimates that's where we are. So we've grown quite a bit. We've in fact grown by 240,000 residents over the last decade, which is
it's a lot.
A big number. Yes. We're also taking a look at some of the other data that's come out about how many more housing units have we added, and what is the how has the racial and ethnic makeup of our population changed over the last decade.
Well, that actually kind of leads into my next question. How does that those changing demographics, ages, household sizes, race, ethnicity impact MORPC's planning efforts?
So I think that we've talked a lot over the last decade through our Insight 2050 work and other planning initiatives about how important it is to pay attention to those demographic makeups of the population as we think about housing preferences, as we think about the needs of the workforce, and how all of that integrates with patterns of land use development and ultimately our transportation systems. So it's all really, really connected and important to pay attention to. What we've learned from this census is what we've all suspected, that we're becoming a more diverse world and we're becoming a more diverse region. Partly that's driven by how important international migration was in increasing our population growth over the last decade. So as we become a more diverse region, it becomes increasingly important that we are focused on equity in all of our planning initiatives and our core transportation work. So whether it's sustainability or transportation planning or looking at data and broadband, making sure that we have a lens on equity and are thinking about how to reach a more diverse Central Ohio population.
Great. So kind of related to that, did the census unveil, any challenges that we weren't really already aware of related to, affordable housing, income inequality, or, some of these other big issues that we're trying to tackle as a region?
Right. So again, the picture is still only partial, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah.
We'll have more information from the Census Bureau later in 2022 with some detailed demographic information from those counts. But right now we did already learn quite a bit. So we found out that while we grew by about as many people this decade as we did the previous decade, we grew by about 20,000 fewer housing units during that same time.
Yeah.
So when we talk about affordable housing, there's kind of the big A affordable housing. That's where we have government subsidies that are encouraging or supporting housing for folks who need it the most. But then there's also the little A affordable housing, which is really impacted by that number that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So if we're building too few housing units, then that increases the demand for housing units. We're seeing that resulting in really low vacancy rates in rental units, really fast turnaround for homeowner products on the market, which we're all seeing anecdotally as really, really hot real estate market. And that has an effect on our lowest earning residents in Central Ohio and their access to housing options. And folks can learn more about our broad kind of work in housing through our regional housing strategy on our website.
And we could have a whole separate, very long discussion about, affordable housing and all of that. So you mentioned Insight 2050 a few times already. So how are we tracking towards those Insight 2050 projections for our population growth? And, any insights on what we might see in 2030 for the census numbers?
Well, let's say get out my crystal ball, which is always the fun part of my job. The answer is that it's always uncertain. We know that right now we have grown beyond what we thought we would grow in the 2020s or in the 2010s. But growth is not linear. There are so many different things that could impact growth over time. Some of them are driven by trends here in Central Ohio. Some of them are driven by trends at the state level or the national level or even the global level that impact migration and so on. COVID-19, for instance, was a recent thing that happened that we still only have a partial picture of what the impact of that has been. And of course, we don't know how it's going to play out over the next decade. And if folks are interested, this is not related to our to the 2020 census, but we did take a closer look at what we think some of those impacts might be around COVID-19 by analyzing a number of data sources and working with partners throughout Central Ohio in a series of policy briefs, which can also be found on our website.
Awesome, great. We'll have to get the link to that to attach to this. So, Liz, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a little bit more about the census results so far. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Susan.